I've got a very sensitive or controversial question. When these so-called Israeli politicians or leaders, do they feel that they are religiously bound to kind of like get rid of the Palestinians and take over that land, or are they
Yeah.
using it, or they're using monetary or financial gains? Which one is it?
It's quite strange that a lot of these Israelis themselves, these Israeli leaders, the members of the parliament. I mean, there's different factions. For example, there's an interesting book. I don't know. I'll probably kind of send the email. It's written by a local South African called Why Israel: The Anatomy of a Zionist Apartheid, a South African perspective, and he goes into details with the different parties that make up the particular Knesset. And by and large, what he argues in this particular book in relation to the political setup in Israel and the political the kind of ideological leanings of a lot of these politicians themselves, a lot of them are secular. There are very few that are basically, for example, he gives you a list of parties, and of course, a lot of these parties, for example, he gives you a summary of the primary political parties in Israel. And you've got the Kadima, the Likud party, the Labour party, the Yisrael Beitenu, the Shas party, the Mafdal party. The only party that is kind of religiously minded, which you probably know, is the Shas party, because that's the ultra-Orthodox Sephardic party, and one of the famous leaders was Rabbi Ovedia Yusuf. If you look at the other parties, for example, like Labour Party, which has been traditionally leftist, although equally genocidal in its basic the way it postulates itself, the way it has perpetuated itself over the years. If you look at some of the people under Likud, people like Ben Gurion and Golda Meir and Yitzhak Rabin, Moshe Dayan, these are not individuals that were peace-loving individuals, but they were secular nonetheless. And then, of course, you've got the Likud party, which is the Menachem Begin, Shamir Netanyahu, and then Kadima, which is Sharon. From what I can gather, a lot of these individuals are not religiously minded. They are secular. But when it suits them and when it's convenient for them, they make the argument that that justifies their existence based on religious grounds. I mean, Theodor Herzl himself and a lot of the individuals that were part and parcel of the early Zionist classical movement were by no means religious. Chaim Weizmann, for example, none of these individuals. And by the way, the late scholar, the brilliant scholar Muhammad Asad, when he was, I may just share this, when he was a correspondent for the Austrian-German newspaper, the Frankfurter Zeitung, he in fact narrates in his book, I believe it's either The Road to Mecca or Islam at the Crossroads, that he was at one of these meetings. He was actually covering one of the meetings. Muhammad Asad, by the way, Leopold Weiss is Muhammad Asad, the famous translator of one of the best Qurans in the 20th century, the translation. But he was at this particular meeting, and he was with Weizmann, and he was with a lot of these Zionist leaders in the early 1920s. And he makes a point that none of them were particularly religiously minded. They were by no means ultra-Orthodox in that sense, but conveniently they used religion as a basis for justifying the particular existence of the state of Israel. And of course, I mean, they appealed to the whole ancient argument that Israel basically was belonging to the Jews. Israel, in fact, was something which was controlled by them at some particular point in ancient history. And so from that particular perspective, they've got some sort of allegiance to the state of Israel. And so this is their homeland. But the reality of the situation, which people also don't know, is that Palestine has never been under Jewish autonomy, at least up till from 1948. From 1948, it had never been under Jewish autonomy for close to 4,000 years. What I mean by that, if you look at the periods that existed in ancient history, for example, even from the time of David, and archaeologically we cannot prove it, but from 1000 BC, from about 1000 BC approximately, it was under Persian rule. I think from about 538 to to 300 BC. It was then under Hellenistic rule, from 300 BC onwards. Subsequently, in the period of 100 BC onwards, going downwards, it becomes under Roman rule. You had the early Roman period, the late Roman period. You then had the Byzantine period, and then in the 6th or 7th century, you have the Arabs. So Jews had never been under Palestine had never been under Jewish autonomy for at least close to 3,000 to 4,000 years, at the very least. And those Jews who basically came or claimed the so-called autonomy of this particular land based on the so-called allusion to the idea of the ancient Israelites being under occupation at some particular point in time and being under so-called political and religious control. If we were to grant that for the sake of argument, the Jews who basically make that particular claim have no linguistic, they've got no genetic, nor do they have any kind of religious link or affiliation with the ancient Israelites. I mean, most of the Jews, I believe it was Shlomo Sand in his book, The Invention of the Jewish People, and of course, I think it was the same point was made by Arthur Koestler in his book, The 13th Tribe, that a lot of the Jews from Europe, from Eastern Europe, from Central Europe, come from, they were actually descendants of Jews who had apparently converted to Judaism in the 7th or 8th century, and they come from Eastern Europe. That's why they call them the kind of Ashkenazi Jews. The Ashkenazi, that's a kind of a term that was used to define a distinct kind of cultural group of Jews who settled in the 10th century in Western Germany. They were converts to Judaism. They were not indigenous to Judaism. Jews who were indigenous to the Palestinian area, or the area which is now Israel, lived side by side with the Palestinians for thousands of years under Ottoman control, and before that under the time of the Abbasids and the Umayyad period. So they've got no linguistic claim. So coming to your initial question, I know we've gone in a roundabout way. A lot of these politicians are by no means religiously minded. They're not religiously minded at any level whatsoever, but they use religion as a basis for justifying their particular mass actions of genocide and genocide. And I may make one particular point. The one thing that comes out all the time is that doesn't Israel have the right to defend itself? And these people are under siege, they being killed. Don't they have the right to defend themselves? But it's quite amazing that whilst the mainstream media are making this particular point, the very leaders in the Knesset, who are basically in control of Israel, who are by no means religious, are not actually raising self-defense. So, for example, when Netanyahu says, we will turn Gaza into an island of ruins, and he invokes the Amalekite massacre in accordance with 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 3, he's not speaking as a religious Jew, although he claimed to be religious. He's secular, but he invokes that as a basis for justifying genocide. When the Israeli extremist, former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, speaks about killing of Palestinians and Gazans because they're animals, and he made it clear when Yoav Gallant stated that there will be no food, no water, no electricity because we are dealing with human animals and cockroaches, and they use language that is being used, that was used basically in the Rwandan genocide. We clearly know that on the one hand, they're using religion as a basis for political expediency, particularly when Netanyahu invokes the Amalekite massacre. And number two, they give the intent to commit war crimes and genocide and destruction and massacre. So when Piers Morgan hypocritically states that, look, I only concern myself, I've got a moral quandary here about the fact that what is the proportionality of Israel's right to self-defense? There's no proportionality. They're not talking about proportionality. When one of the reservists, the Minister of Finance, Smotrich, who tells Israeli Arabs that the only reason that they are here is because Israel did not finish the job in 1948. they give the intent to commit war crimes and genocide and destruction and massacre, like the minister who spoke about nuking Gaza. Or, so the point is, how many Palestinian babies need to be slaughtered, how many families need to be incinerated due to Israel's carpet bombing for it to be contingent to Israel's so-called hypocritical claim to self-defense? It doesn't make sense whatsoever. So they use religion when it suits them, and of course, when it's expedient, they claim land. But in reality, most of them are not basically Jewish from a religious point of view. I mean, you look at the social element in Israel. The largest gay pride parade festival, openly allowed, I believe, subject to correction, it is in Israel. If you look at, for example, a lot of these practices that are committed by Israel, I mean, they're not religiously minded, but when it comes to land, when it comes to property, when it comes to control, they use religion as a basis for political expediency. So that would be my take and response to your question, Brother Muhammad, on that particular issue. And it's quite clear that these people are out on their insane quest for total destruction, and they want the land of Gaza for their own